Hi everyone, I'm Hannie Lawlor. I'm a third year D.Phil student with OCLU at Wolfson College, and the title of my paper today is Balancing Acts, Negotiating Relations in Response to Trauma in 21st Century French and Spanish Women's Life Writing. In the 21st century landscape of life writing, the relational nature of every autobiographical endeavour goes virtually unquestioned. Theory and practice alike demonstrate a keen awareness that any one life story is made up of multiple others, shaped by the many lives with which it intersects. Coined by Susan Stanford Friedman to describe female-authored autobiography, the concept of relationality now encompasses all life writing. And engaging with these connections comes to the fore in what Paul John Akin terms relational lives, when two or more life stories come to be told in the same textual space. In these texts, the stories of proximate others, often family members, are recounted alongside that of the author. Although by no means written by women exclusively, so Art Spiegelman's Mouse, for example, is a pioneering work in this genre, these intergenerational stories have emerged most persistently in female-authored life writing. And while much emphasis has rightly been placed on the vital role these relational dynamics play, little attention has been paid to the challenges in texts such as these of navigating and representing these relations. Neither Friedman nor Akin, for example, address in their theories of relationality the inescapable tensions that arise in balancing the different stories, voices, and perspectives that are implicated. My project aims to demonstrate that in contemporary life writing practice, by contrast, women writers are consciously grappling with these very challenges. What I perceive as the crucial development in the 21st century texts that I have chosen to explore is their in-depth engagement with the narrative and ethical questions involved in writing relational lives. My corpus draws into dialogue texts from two very different traditions of life writing. Text published in France, which has been consistently at the centre of output, theory and innovation in autobiography, and in Spain, where the genre has been given considerably less prominence. I have found, however, that many recent life writing projects published by French and Spanish women authors share a similar focus. At the heart of these projects is a fusion of autobiographical and biographical modes, with which the authors foreground the bonds between an individual story and the ongoing family history in which it unfolds. In this thesis, I focus on the questions that recur over the course of these writing projects. To what point can and should we tell other people's stories? By can, I refer to individual writing perspective and whether we can claim insight into the perspectives of others. By should, to the dangers of speaking in place of the subject. The texts that I examine draw these questions into sharp relief. They are examples of what I will refer to as post-traumatic life writing, in which the narrative connection between writing and non-writing subjects is as problematic as it is paramount. In cases where suffering has long been kept silent, this connection offers perhaps the only opportunity for the story to be heard, told from an authorial platform that the victim herself lacks. Yet trauma also tears a seemingly irrevocable hole between their life experiences. How can the author testify to an experience that eludes the grasp even of its subject? In ethical terms, such attempts at representation risk being met with accusations of appropriation, of the author laying claim to an experience that is not her own. This transpires not only in cases of traumatic experience, but in ethical studies of relational life writing more broadly. The principal problem, as theorists including G. Thomas Kuhse see it, stems from the individual nature of authorship. They presume a power imbalance that's tipped conclusively in favour of the writing subject, and so seek to determine to what extent authors appropriate the story of the other that they write. Evaluating ethics in this way, I would argue, reveals that despite the emphasis placed on intersubjective lives, current autobiography theory still labours under the assumption that a life story can indeed be one's own. Tensions emerge, therefore, between these implications of ownership and trauma theory, which conceives the belated assimilation of life-shattering experiences as passing the burden of testimony to subsequent generations. So Hungarian-French psychoanalysts Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok developed the concept of transgenerational haunting, and more recently Marianne Hirsch came up with the concept of post-memory, which both theorise a traumatic transmission that blurs any fixed boundaries between mine and yours. With post-memory, Hirsch draws attention to the danger that such transmission poses, not only for the silent subjects in terms of the appropriation of their experiences, but also for successive generations, whose stories risk being overshadowed by those which they are compelled to articulate. In contrast to the one-sided interpretation by autobiography theorists of the power dynamics in writing lives, Hirsch thus points to a double displacement, a kind of two-way struggle for narrative space. In my thesis, I examine how examples of life writing, published over the last 2 decades in France and Spain, expose and explore this relational struggle. I focus on the strategies that authors put in place to navigate the relationship between writing and non-writing subjects when articulating painful experiences. By comparing the different autobiographical, autofictional, and fictional approaches that the authors employ in response, I analyse the various ways in which they strive to represent other voices that are waiting to be heard, as well as their own. For the remainder of this paper, I will focus on one of the key strategies for testifying to the voices that are missing that has emerged in my study of these texts. So that's to say, telling the story through a kind of impossible conversation. Several of the authors that I have worked on move in different ways towards these conversational dynamics, but nowhere are they more clearly apparent than in Milena Busquets' También esto pasará, which has been translated into English as This Too Shall Pass. In También esto pasará, Busquets recounts the loss of her mother, celebrated Spanish author Esther Tusquets, who died following a lengthy battle with Parkinson's disease. The text is autofictional, and the story is narrated in the first person by Blanca, a fictional character whose life resonates strongly with that of the author, so in terms of age, place, family history. Grief and sex together form the focal point of the text, as Blanca relays the series of flirtations and sexual encounters that she pursues, so with her 2 ex-husbands, a married lover, a handsome stranger, and several old acquaintances. And these encounters act as a screen for her intense sorrow as she seeks to come to grips with the loss of her mother. Poignantly, the site at which all these relationships intersect is Cadaqués, so it's the town in which the mother is buried. After the funeral, Blanca goes with her children and her 2 best friends to stay in what was formerly the mother's house and her own childhood holiday home. She gives an account of her fleeting encounters as various lovers, past and present, pass through Cadaqués, encounters which all revolve, according to Blanca, around what she calls the primary relationship between mother and daughter. And these erotic exploits function as something of a delay on the part of the narrator to visit her mother's grave, and the action in Cadaqués concludes with her eventual failed attempt to enter the cemetery in the early hours of the morning on the way back from a party when the gates of the cemetery are locked. The narrative begins then at her mother's funeral, and Blanca's opening reflections point to an all-absorbing focus on herself in her grief. The style closely resembles an interior monologue, and we don't find out until the end of the first page that Blanca is in fact giving an account of her mother's funeral. This consummately first-person narrative is quickly punctuated, however, by an impossible address to her mother that will run throughout the text. And contrary to what we might expect from an apostrophe to a lost loved one, the address begins with an accusation. Blanca blames her for the notable absences from the funeral, claiming that her mother's dementia was responsible for the breakdown of both their relationships with these people. Quote, "It's your fault, Mum, obviously. You went along depositing, bit by bit and without realising it, all the responsibility for your waning happiness on my shoulders. And it weighed on me. It weighed on me even when I was far away. Even when I moved away from you a little, once I recognised that if I didn't, it wouldn't only be you who would die beneath your wreckage." End quote. This address gives a sense of the distinctly oral register that Busquets employs throughout También esto pasará, one which reinforces the underlying premise of recreating a conversation with her mother as she articulates her loss. The distance that Blanca tries and fails to achieve here speaks to a wider tension between over-identification and separation in the text. In an interview, Busquets suggests that the danger that Blanca voices of being subsumed in this relationship redoubles after the death of the loved one. She states that, quote, "It is very dangerous to be close to the dead. You have to keep a certain distance." In narrative terms, this perhaps explains Busquets' own recourse to autofiction in recounting her loss. She seems to put a further distancing mechanism in place, however, when she opens out what otherwise risks being a consuming attempt to recreate a communication between mother and daughter. The seeming singularity of Blanca's address is subverted sharply when the mother is usurped as addressee by a handsome stranger that Blanca spots at the funeral. So she asks him in this imagined conversation whether he doesn't think the girl he's with is a bit on the short side for him. Although Blanca's asides in the text are firstly and most frequently to her mother, therefore, these are interspersed continually with similar apostrophes to her various lovers. The repeated shifts in referent testified to a plural shifting address structure in También esto pasará. Opening up the conversation between mother and daughter in this way in no way suggests that the multiple liaisons on which Blanca embarks somehow replaced or offer an alternative to the relationship that she has lost. On the contrary, Blanca's self-analysis positions the mother-daughter relationship as the starting point for all the interactions in the text. In a kind of Freudian-style self-analysis, she describes the mother-daughter relationship as the first love, of which all subsequent amores are simply a replica. Most importantly, however, she conceives this relationship as determining her own sense of where she stands. She describes her place in the world as having been determined by her mother's gaze. Quote, "I can no longer open a book without wanting to see your face of calm and concentration, without knowing that I'll never see it again, and, what's maybe more painful still, that it will never see me again. I will never again be looked at by your eyes. My place in the world was in your gaze." End quote. The principal source of the daughter's grief, over and above never seeing the mother again, is thus the prospect of never being seen by her. Blanca's place, as she perceives it, is contingent on being the object of the mother's gaze. Her erotic exploits are driven, at least in part, by a desire to fill in this missing motherly look. Making herself the object of the male gaze becomes a means of affirming her existence in the absence of her mother. The transient and ever disappointing nature of these romantic encounters, however, mean that the lover's look is never sustained, so hence the constantly shifting reference. To relocate her own place, Blanca thus turns instead to telling the story as a means of reinstating the mother as the subject of the gaze. By addressing the mother, Blanca positions her as reader. So the narrative gaze, in other words, becomes a kind of proxy for the mother's missing look. Making the mother present is thus portrayed as the strategy that Blanca adopts principally in order to gain some purchase on her own position in the story. The substitution embedded in these narrative dynamics assumes an extra-diegetic dimension when considering the autofictional form of the text and the relation between author and narrator. Blanca's narrative acts as a fictional substitute, we could say, for Busquets' real experience, through which Busquets at once seeks her own place following the death of Esther Busquets, and in particular her place as author in the wake of Busquets' literary renown. Busquets depicts the mother's gaze as successfully restored through Blanca's narrative by effecting a kind of textual resurrection. The series of erotic exploits concludes with Blanca seeing a former lover at a party and choosing not to sleep with him. Her decision breaks through the delay that sexual desire has afforded to this point in the text, and once she has left the party, Blanca goes to visit her mother's grave. The failed visit ends, however, with a fantasized transportation of the mother outside of the cemetery gates. Blanca sees the mother walking along the pier below to set sail into the afterlife. Quote, "Before stepping aboard, she turns around, smiles at me and says, 'This too shall pass,' and she gives me a wink." End quote. At first, this textual resurrection seems to testify to the control that the daughter holds over the narration of their shared story. Given the eponymous reference that draws the scene to a close, we might read this image as a microcosm of the text as a whole. The mother appears tellingly in response to the daughter's invocation, "Mum, Mum," outside the cemetery gates, a clear nod to the wider use of direct address. In turning to smile at her daughter, she becomes the subject of the gaze, and so appears to fulfill Blanca's wish to be looked at. The agency behind the recreation of their relationship from this perspective seems to lie definitively with the daughter. Nonetheless, any perception of narrative agency as purely one-sided is complicated by the fact that it is the mother, and not the daughter, whose words give the text its title. The influence that this instance of direct speech grants the mother amplifies as the title is discussed further. For Blanca, the phrase derives from the traditional story that her mother told her to comfort her after the death of her father. So in this tale, an emperor gathers together all the wisest people in the kingdom to find a phrase that works in every circumstance. Quote, "We have the phrase, it is the following, 'This too shall pass,'" and she added, "Pain and grief pass, just as euphoria and happiness do. I know now that this isn't true. I will live with your loss until I die." End quote. So, "This too shall pass, también esto pasará," is their collective solution. As part of a death story that the mother tells, the title signals the role that she plays in the narrative process. Agency shifts sharply away from the daughter when considering that, despite Blanca's rejection of the mother's axiom, it becomes the name of the text. In espousing the mother's version of loss rather than the daughter's, Busquets signals a more collaborative narrative process than seems to be present in the project that Blanca outlines. This synergic narration is at the heart of Busquets' resurrection of the relationship with her own mother in También esto pasará. Given that Esther Busquets was a renowned literary figure, writing is a key component of this relationship. The challenge of striking a balance between identification and separation is not merely represented by, but embedded in, the writing process, as Busquets comes to articulate her identity as author. The solution that she seems to propose is the integration of her mother's writing practice into her own. Motifs from Busquets' work are present throughout También esto pasará, creating a kind of dialogue between their oeuvres. Chief among these is the recourse to water imagery. So in addition to its prominence in the Cadaqués landscape, the sea is used as a figure for sex and also to describe the mother's illness. So she describes Parkinson's disease as flooding her mother's brain. The sea stands at the centre of Busquets' most famous work, The Same Sea as Every Summer, which is also set over the course of a summer in Cadaqués. Busquets consolidates this intertextual dialogue via an explicit allusion to its title, when Blanca discovers that even as the mother was dying, she ensured that the boat on Cadaqués was put back on the water. Quote, "Madness, Mum, just madness. Did you really think that you would be able to go sailing? Will the same sea still be here, even now you are gone?" End quote. The image of the boat on the water, as we have seen, also frames the scene of the mother's resurrection in También esto pasará. If we read this scene in the light of the reference made to Busquets' the same sea, the afterlife that Busquets figures in this resurrection is one that is textual. Transported outside of the restrictions that the cemetery imposes, the mother-daughter relationship seems poised to live on in También esto pasará, itself a line from Busquets' text beaching after the last shipwreck, through the enmeshment of their writing practices. What happens then, in this case, to the navigation of a more balanced distance from the mother in the wake of loss? On the face of it, the enmeshment of their writing practices seems to fall prey to the danger that Busquets outlines of over-identifying with the lost loved one. Yet the enmeshment that she effects in fact resists any wholesale incorporation of the mother and her writing into the text. As she resurrects her mother from the closed-off cemetery and reburies her in the text, so to speak, she moves away from the singular monument to the mother that any kind of textual tomb would represent. The shifting structure of address and multiple liaison that she recounts point rather towards proliferation, so a process that we could conceive as a scattering of the ashes. The remnants of the mother-daughter relationship permeate every aspect of the text, much like the telling of their story is peppered with references to Busquets' writing. Towards the end of También esto pasará, this scattering becomes the very figure for the bond between them. When Blanca recounts moments when her and her mother would catch each other's eye, she describes the mutual experience of their gazes meeting as a magical connection, one which produces pixie dust. Quote, "I remember us having looked at each other at one point, across a table full of people, or walking through a new city, or in the middle of the ocean, and having both felt that fairy dust was fluttering over our heads, and that perhaps we wouldn't soar off there and then, like Peter Pan claimed, but we almost would." End quote. Rather than Blanca simply being looked at by the mother, Busquets develops the gaze in this image into one that is reciprocal. The pixie dust that she perceives as sparked by this mother-daughter connection also symbolises the meeting of their writing projects. As Busquets goes on to specify, this image is taken from the fairy tale Peter Pan, references to which frame Busquets the same sea as every summer. If we take this pixie dust, then, as representative of Busquets' enmeshment of the writing practices in También esto pasará, their collaborative storytelling can indeed be conceived as a kind of scattering. The resulting mother-daughter relationship marks a distinct shift away from the over-identification that is illustrated at the start of the text. Diametrically opposed to the heavy burden that Blanca described in the opening pages, the near potential for flight that this pixie dust grants them conceives the connection between them as virtually weightless. It seems to symbolise over-identification being successfully averted, in other words, even as the writing projects of mother and daughter coalesce. The bypassing of such a burden relies perhaps on the ever-incomplete alignment that Busquets expresses in this passage. Concluding with almost, she frustrates any simple equation of the mother-daughter connection as it is depicted here and the fairy tale on which Busquets draws. The partial nature of this overlap preserves a gap between the texts, then, even as Busquets connects their writing practices in order to tell their shared story. Much like the presence of Busquets' personal experience in the autofiction that she creates, the influence and memory of the mother is scattered throughout. It permeates all aspects of the text and its characters, but without subsuming them. The same is true of the references that Busquets interweaves to Busquets' oeuvre. Their inclusion is a testament to the mother's writing shaping that of her daughter, but in no way detracts from Busquets' own identity as an author. This balance between identification and individuation emerges most clearly in the conception of legacy at the end of the text. So after Blanca's assertion of the unremitting grip of the mother's loss, she lists the characteristics, both positive and negative, that the mother has passed on to her. So her falling in love at first sight, her passion for art and literature, her absence of conscience, and her sense of rebellion, to name just a few. She also lists the qualities that she claims not to have inherited herself, so her mother's magnanimity and her tolerance, amongst others, but which she sees as beginning to blossom in her children. Even as Blanca laments her absence, therefore, the mother's continuing presence is palpable in how she shapes the characters of subsequent generations. Recognizing the persistence of these characteristics leads Blanca to affirm the prolongation of the mother's story, promising that, quote, "someday we'll talk a lot about you," end quote. She points to a future dialogue through which this story will be perpetuated, a transgenerational space that emulates Busquets' dedication of the text to her parents as well as to her children. She leaves the text deliberately open-ended in a way that makes room for future generations to determine the direction that the family story will take. As Blanca envisages the future discussion and perpetuation of the mother's story with her children, she also contemplates the plans they will later make independently of her. It is by opening out the mother-daughter story into a transgenerational conversation that Busquets envisages more of a balance between keeping her mother close and moving forward with her life. Blanca's potential dialogue with her children testifies to a continuing relationship with the mother through subsequent generations and their storytelling at the same time as they live on without her. To conclude then, key to narrating the shared story of loss in También esto pasará is the impossible conversation to which Busquets aspires, a conversation that she seems to partially recreate through the text. The fact that within this so-called conversation, the voice of the lost loved one is, of course, missing, raises significant ethical concerns. So is the structure of address that Busquets employs, in fact, a form of prosopopia, in which the so-called interlocutor, following Paul de Man, is, quote, "a fiction of the voice from beyond the grave," end quote. Given that de Man perceives this fabrication of the other's voice as a form of defacing the deceased, such an attempt to restore the loved one's presence through the text invites accusations of ventriloquism. And so this is in keeping with G. Thomas Kuza's assertion that, quote, "collaborative autobiography is inherently ventriloquistic," end quote. Jacques Derrida, on the other hand, puts forward a rather different possibility when he theorizes what he calls an ongoing conversation with the lost loved one in his theory of mourning. He considers the supposedly now silent loved one to have always already spoken in bereaved memory, given the trace of their speech that it bears. And Busquets appears to embed this trace of the other's voice by conceiving the conversation as a form of intertextual exchange, so the mother's voice remains at least partly accessible after her death via her own oeuvre. As perpetually partial as this conversation is in También esto pasará, it injects an element of reciprocity into the narrative process. Such reciprocity signals the influence that the loved one holds even after her death over the daughter who is left behind to write their shared story. It testifies to a continuing connection between their life stories that in no way belies or compromises their inevitable separation. Acknowledging this separation, in fact, plays a key role in how Busquets circumvents the potential ventriloquizing of the mother's voice in the dialogue that she seeks to create in writing. Although her intertextual exchange does go some way to making present the perspective of the mother, she also draws attention to the gaps left by her interlocutor's lack of reply. So she does so primarily when she underscores the manifestly one-sided nature of her opening accusation to the mother. So when she says, "It's your fault, Mum," obviously. She foregrounds the missing side, the missing other side in the story that will ensue. There are instances, of course, in which the mother's reply is written in, so inferred by the author or narrator in what they go on to write. On the whole, however, Busquets refrains from positing a response on the mother's behalf. Through the balance that Busquets seems to strike in this way between making present her mother's perspective and recognising its absence, something of a middle ground emerges in the text between the extremes of consuming identification on the one hand and definitive separation from the mother on the other. This balance relies, however, on a certain alignment of the viewpoints of writing and non-writing subjects, or in terms of the dynamics of address that we've seen, on their narrative gazes pointing in a similar direction. The mother's life in this text is presented as peculiarly legible. Any serious divergences between her perspective and that of the daughter, any secrets that they may have kept from one another, remain buried. In the final chapter of my thesis, by contrast, I turn to intergenerational stories in which the perspectives of the multiple subjects are in no such alignment. The question of whether life writing can indeed make room for the reply of the voices that are missing, which Busquets appears to affirm, comes into sharp relief in stories where the interpretations of writing and non-writing subjects differ dramatically. In the face of these clashing viewpoints, the answer to this question becomes far less straightforward. The final part of my thesis considers whether the so-called conversations that the authors create can ever accommodate competing accounts without one writing out the other. My overarching question, which I will leave you with now, is whether life writing can, and indeed whether it should, perform a kind of negotiation, a dialogue between different voices and versions. Thank you.